Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. Picture yourself deep below the surface of the ocean. It's the height of the Cold War, and you're serving aboard a nuclear submarine. Just imagine it. Impossibly tight spaces, literally zero windows, and you're breathing recycled air. But above all else, there is absolutely no easy way out if something goes wrong. Suddenly, a seawater pipe ruptures. And at hundreds of feet down, the ocean doesn't argue. And it definitely doesn't ask for permission. But it does tell you one terrifying thing. You are running out of time. Water is surging in relentlessly. You grab the comms handset, and the announcement echoes through the sub, flooding in the engine room. The commander instantly orders an emergency surface. But the crew, they don't just sit back and ride it up. They scramble to isolate the system, stopping the flood before the compartment fills, before lives are lost. Notice what they didn't do. They didn't wait for a data report. They didn't ask for committee consensus. They acted instantly. Because in high-stakes situations, hesitation is fatal. Now, if seawater flooding wasn't scary enough, there was also radiation to worry about, silent and invisible. To manage this risk, crew members working in the reactor compartment wore two dosimeters to measure their exposure. One dosimeter gave real-time feedback. Sure, it was a bit less accurate, but it warned you instantly so you could protect yourself. The other one? Well, it was extremely accurate, but there was a massive catch. It could only be read after you left the compartment. Think about that for a second. In a life or death scenario, perfect accuracy is entirely meaningless if it arrives too late to actually help anyone. Section 1. Defining the certainty gap. Let's move to and see how this builds. So, if we transition from that proactive, life-saving environment of a military sub to the often reactive, profit-driven corporate world where invisible threats lurk, we encounter something fascinating. Food safety expert and Professor Darren Dittweiler teaches future leaders about a crucial concept. He calls it the certainty gap. It's defined as the span of time between when someone first realizes they might need to do something and when they finally feel confident enough to actually act on it. Closing this gap requires immense courage, deep humility, and the absolute will to put people over profits. But unfortunately, instead of acting, what do we usually see? Leaders hesitate. Here is exactly how that deadly hesitation plays out in corporate culture, step by step. First, leaders realize there might be a need to act. But instead of just taking decisive action, step 2 kicks in. They delay. They look for absolute confirmation. They want consensus, or they seek cover. They demand more data just to be sure. And then step 3, they finally take action, but only after the harm is already done. They wait until the crisis is completely public, and the headlines are screaming about massive recalls and deadly outbreaks. Section 2, the tragic cost of delay. We really have to look at the tragic human cost of this delay. Whenever a massive failure hits the news, the public always asks the exact same question. Why didn't anyone stop this? Well, back in 1993, Darren Dittweiler asked this very question when his son, Riley, who was just 16 months old, had just learned how to walk. And one day he contracted E. coli. Now, this infection was tied to a massive contaminated fast food hamburger outbreak. But the wild part? Riley never even ate a hamburger. He contracted the deadly pathogen from another child in his daycare class through person-to-person exposure, which, honestly, was something very few people even realized was possible at the time. The events that followed are absolutely devastating. In the hospital, suffering from renal failure, little Riley sat on his dad's lap. He was pointing at an IV bag and asking for Baba, his toddler word for a baby bottle. He just wanted comfort, but he couldn't have it. He was flown 90 miles to a larger hospital, his tiny body dwarfed by wires and monitors in the pediatric intensive care unit. The pathogen had completely destroyed his intestines, which surgeons had to remove. He fell into a coma. And tragically, Darren's next memory of his son was seeing him outside the hospital, carried in the world's smallest coffin. Riley was the fourth and final child to die in the landmark 1993 Jack-in-the-Box E. coli outbreak. So the crucial point is that this unimaginable tragedy wasn't caused because leaders lacked the right tools, or because they were completely missing data. No, it happened because leaders chose to delay. They hesitated. They intentionally ignored the real-time warnings. Remember that first dosimeter we talked about? The one that would have allowed them to act in time? Instead, they prioritized the second dosimeter, the one that only confirmed the disaster after the fact, when children were already dying in hospitals. Section 3, a pattern of ignored warnings. After Riley's funeral, officials tried to assure Darren that this was just an isolated incident, an anomaly. But the data proves it absolutely wasn't. It was merely the exposure of a horrific systemic pattern that continues today. 100,000. I really want that number to sink in. Since little Riley died in 1993, nearly 100,000 people have died from foodborne pathogens in America. That's a staggering rate of 3,000 preventable deaths every single year. And the financial toll of these failures? It costs America tens of billions of dollars annually. Yet every single time one of these crises happens, industry executives step up to the microphones, feign shock, and say, "We didn't know. It was a surprise." But the reality is, it is never a surprise. Literally never. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why it's never a surprise. Just look at these ignored red flags pulled straight from public records. We're talking about a company blatantly ignoring 8 state-level inspections that revealed thousands of live and dead rats in their warehouse. I mean, wow. In another case, a facility failed over 60 federal inspections due to serious sanitation issues, and absolutely nothing changed until people got sick. In some of the worst cases, companies actively hid test results, falsified records, and obstructed investigations. The red flags were screaming, but corporate leaders chose to ignore them long before any public crisis to protect their bottom line. There have been consequences, of course. Major brands like Chipotle, Bluebell Ice Cream, and Family Dollar have paid tens of millions of dollars in fines. The executives at the Peanut Corporation of America were even sentenced to prison. Yet people constantly ask, why hasn't anything changed? Well, the answer is simple. Because we haven't changed the leadership mindset. Too many leaders still operate in a culture that prioritizes short-term financial gain over long-term safety. They view the red flags, or the whistleblowers raising them, as the actual threat. Section 4. Leading before it's too late. So how do we fix this? How do we lead before it's too late? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it shows this certainty gap isn't just a food industry problem. It exists in literally any system where there's risk. Climate change, finance, manufacturing, tech, public health, the military. The fatal flaw is exactly the same across the board. Leaders who minimize the threat, hesitate to act, and then point fingers when it all falls apart. It starts with a harsh reality about accountability. Doing nothing is still a decision. Waiting for more data is an active decision. Minimizing risk is a decision. And it's a costly decision paid for by consumers, by communities, and by children like Riley. True accountability cannot be dodged simply by claiming you needed more information before acting. So I want to ask you directly, as you look at your own work, your leadership, your life, which dosimeter are you using? Are you relying on the tool that allows you to listen to faint signals and act in time to prevent disaster? Or are you waiting for absolute certainty, using the dosimeter that simply confirms the cause of the tragedy long after it's too late? Let's contrast these two approaches to leadership under pressure. On one side, we have the typical corporate response, demanding more data, seeking consensus, protecting the profit margins, and ultimately reacting far too late. On the other side, we have true leadership. It's exactly like what we saw on that submarine at the very beginning, understanding the risks, listening to the faint signals, and acting immediately to protect lives without waiting for an invitation or a committee vote. Real leaders do not ignore the early warnings. They listen when the signals are faint, and they act immediately. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. The solution to the certainty gap isn't more data. It's simply the courage to act early and the ironclad will to put people over profits. The warning signs are flashing all around us right now. Will you be the kind of leader who acts in time?